The air above Normandy was burning. June 6, 1944. D-Day. The largest amphibious invasion in human history was unfolding below, and in the sky, a battle for supremacy raged with an intensity that would decide the fate of millions. Supreme Commander Dwight D. Eisenhower stood in the command center, his jaw clenched as he reviewed the initial reports. American forces were struggling on Omaha Beach. British troops were fighting house to house in Cannes. And somewhere above it all, flying what he had privately called caveman dives, were the Canadian pilots he'd dismissed just weeks earlier. He didn't know it yet, but those same pilots were about to rewrite the rules of aerial combat and save thousands of Allied lives in the process. This is the story of how a group of underestimated warriors became legends. 3 months before D-Day, Squadron Leader James "Stocky" Edwards sat in a briefing room in southern England, listening to American tactical advisors explain the proper way to engage German fighters. The room was filled with pilots from various Allied nations, but the Canadians sat together in the back, their leather jackets worn and patched, their faces weathered by 2 years of combat over Europe. The American officer, a lieutenant colonel with exactly 17 hours of combat experience, was drawing elaborate diagrams on the chalkboard. The key to success, he announced with the confidence of someone who'd read every manual but survived no real battles, is maintaining altitude advantage and executing controlled, calculated attacks. Diving attacks are reckless, wasteful, and frankly, primitive. Edwards glanced at his wingman, Flight Lieutenant Screwball Bulling, who was cleaning his fingernails with a pocket knife. Bulling had 31 confirmed kills. The American instructor had 0. Caveman tactics, the instructor continued, have no place in modern aerial warfare. The phrase hung in the air. Caveman tactics. Edwards felt his jaw tighten, but he said nothing. He'd learned long ago that combat would speak louder than any argument. But the damage was done. Within days, the phrase had reached Eisenhower himself, who was already dealing with the complex politics of commanding a truly multinational force. The Canadian squadrons, operating with the RAF, were using unconventional tactics that made the by-the-book American commanders nervous. High-speed diving attacks. Low-level strafing runs. Aggressive pursuit that often meant flying alone deep into enemy territory. They fight like mavericks, one of Eisenhower's advisors reported. Brave, certainly, but undisciplined. These caveman dives of theirs are going to get people killed. Eisenhower, a man who valued order and coordination above all else, made a note. The Canadians would be given limited roles in the initial phases of the invasion. Support roles. Patrol duties. Let the Americans and British handle the primary air superiority missions. It was a decision he would come to regret within hours of the invasion's start. Edwards had joined the Royal Canadian Air Force in 1940, 3 days after his 20th birthday. He'd grown up in Saskatchewan, where the sky stretched forever and the winter wind taught you respect for the elements. Flying wasn't just a skill there, it was a language you learned to speak with your whole body. By 1944, he'd flown over 200 combat missions. He'd seen friends shot down over the channel, watched bombers he was supposed to protect torn apart by German cannons, and learned that the difference between living and dying often came down to a fraction of a second and the willingness to do what others called impossible. The caveman dive wasn't caveman at all. It was physics, geometry, and nerve. The Messerschmitt Me-109 was a masterpiece of German engineering. Fast, maneuverable, deadly. In level flight, it could outrun most Allied fighters. In a sustained dogfight, its superior climb rate gave it a crucial advantage. German pilots were well-trained, experienced, and fighting over their own territory. But the Me-109 had weaknesses, and Edwards had spent 2 years learning every single one. The German fighters' control surfaces stiffened dramatically at high speed. In a steep dive exceeding 400 miles per hour, the Me-109 became increasingly difficult to maneuver. The pilot had to fight the stick with both hands, and pulling out of the dive required both strength and distance. Edwards and his fellow Canadians had developed a tactic that exploited this weakness perfectly. They would patrol at high altitude, watching for German formations below. When they spotted prey, they would roll inverted and dive almost vertically, building tremendous speed. By the time the German pilots realized they were under attack, the Canadians would be screaming down at over 450 miles per hour, firing a quick burst, then using their momentum to zoom back up to altitude before the enemy could respond. It required split-second timing, perfect gunnery, and nerves of absolute steel. Pull up too early and you'd miss. Pull up too late, and you'd either black out from the G-forces or drill yourself into the ground. The American instructors called it primitive. The Canadians called it effective. By June 1944, Edwards' squadron had refined the technique to an art form. They could spot a German formation from 8 miles away, calculate the intercept angle in their heads, and execute the attack with the precision of a surgical strike. Their kill ratios were among the highest in the RAF, but they operated in the shadows, flying missions that rarely made the headlines. That was about to change. The night before D-Day, Edwards couldn't sleep. None of them could. They knew what was coming, had known for weeks. Every airfield in southern England was packed with aircraft. Every port was filled with ships. You could feel the tension in the air, electric and heavy. In the pilot's quarters, someone was playing cards. Someone else was writing a letter home. Bulling sat alone, staring at a photograph of a girl in Montreal. He hadn't spoken to anyone in hours. "You scared?" Edwards asked him. Bulling looked up, his eyes distant. "Terrified." "You?" "Same." "Good. Means we're still sane." They launched at 0400 hours, 90 minutes before the first landing craft hit the beaches. The plan called for continuous air patrols over the invasion fleet, with fighters stacked at different altitudes to intercept any German aircraft that tried to attack the ships or the beaches. The Canadians had been assigned a patrol sector 10 miles inland, a relatively quiet area where intelligence suggested minimal German air activity. It was, Edwards realized immediately, a polite way of keeping them out of the main action. "Command doesn't trust us," his number 2 Flight Lieutenant Robert "Buck" McNair said over the radio as they formed up. "Then we'll have to make them trust us," Edwards replied. The channel was dark below them, but to the east the sky was beginning to lighten. And stretched out across the water, barely visible in the pre-dawn gloom, was an armada that defied comprehension. Thousands of ships. Tens of thousands of men. The entire weight of the Allied war effort concentrated in one desperate gamble. Edwards felt the weight of it pressing down on him. All those lives depending on men like him to keep the German Luftwaffe away from the beaches. "Contact," Bulling's voice crackled over the radio. 11 o'clock high. Big formation. Looks like at least 40 Me-109s. Edwards' blood went cold. 40 German fighters heading straight for the invasion fleet. And between them and those ships were exactly 12 Canadian Spitfires. The math was brutal and simple. They were outnumbered more than 3 to 1. "Command, this is Maple Leader," Edwards transmitted. "We have visual on large enemy formation heading 270 Angels 20. Request immediate support." Static. Then a British controller's voice, tense and apologetic. "Maple Leader negative. All other squadrons are engaged. You're on your own." Edwards looked at his fuel gauge, his ammunition counter, and then at the German formation silhouetted against the brightening sky. Behind him, 11 other pilots were waiting for his decision. Young men, most of them not yet 25, some on their first combat mission. He thought about those American instructors and their lectures about proper tactics. He thought about Eisenhower's doubts and the dismissive comments about caveman dives. Then he thought about the men on those beaches, who in less than an hour would be running into machine gun fire with nothing but faith and courage. "All aircraft, this is Maple Leader. We're going in." "Boss," McNair said carefully, "there's 40 of them. I can count, Buck. Form up for attack pattern Delta." There was a pause. Delta was their vertical dive attack. The caveman dive. "Jesus, Stocky," someone muttered over the radio. "You got a better idea?" "I'm listening," Edwards said. "We've got maybe 2 minutes before they reach the fleet. After that, thousands of boys down there are going to die. So we can either follow the rules and watch it happen, or we can do what we do best." Silence. Then one by one his pilots checked in. "Maple 2 ready?" "Maple 3 with you." "Maple 4, let's show these bastards how Canadians fight." Edwards pushed the throttle forward and began to climb. The Merlin engine roared and his Spitfire clawed for altitude. Behind him, his squadron formed up, 12 aircraft rising into the dawn sky like birds of prey. The German formation was maintaining steady course, apparently unaware of the small Canadian force above and behind them. They were flying in standard combat spread, Me-109s in tight formation, probably planning to dive on the ships from altitude and strafe the landing craft. Edwards did the math in his head. Altitude differential, 5,000 feet. Distance, 6 miles. Closing speed, approximately 400 miles per hour. Time to intercept, 45 seconds. "Arm your guns," he ordered. "We're going to hit the rear of their formation. Single pass, shoot and climb. Don't chase, don't engage in turning fights. Speed is life. Stay fast, stay high." He rolled his Spitfire inverted, hung there for a heartbeat looking up at the earth below, and then pulled the stick forward. The nose dropped toward the vertical, and suddenly he was diving, falling like a stone, the engine screaming and the airframe shuddering as the speed built past 300, past 350, past 400 miles per hour. The world compressed into a tunnel. The German fighters grew larger in his windscreen, their black crosses visible now. He could see the pilots in their cockpits, focused forward, not looking up or behind. The textbook said you couldn't aim accurately at these speeds. The American instructors had said it was suicide to attack from a vertical dive. But Edwards had done this 100 times, knew exactly how the Spitfire would respond, knew exactly where the bullets would go. At 600 yards he opened fire. The Spitfire shuddered as 8.303 machine guns blazed, the tracers arcing down through the sky. His first burst hit an ME-109 in the right wing root. The German fighter staggered, then rolled inverted and began to spin, black smoke pouring from its engine. Edwards didn't watch it fall. He was already pulling back on the stick, the G-forces crushing him into his seat, his vision narrowing to a tunnel as the blood drained from his brain. The horizon spun, and then he was climbing again, using his momentum to rocket back up above the German formation. Behind him, 11 other Canadians executed the same maneuver. 11 vertical dives. 11 perfect attacks. The rear of the German formation simply disintegrated. In less than 15 seconds, 8 Me-109s were falling from the sky, trailing smoke and flames. The German formation broke apart in confusion. Some tried to turn and fight, others dove for the deck, a few tried to continue toward the ships. But the coordination was gone, replaced by chaos. Reforming at Angels 25, Edwards called. Don't get separated. His squadron climbed back to altitude, regrouped, and turned for another pass. Below them, the German pilots were still trying to figure out what had hit them. Again, Edwards said. Same tactic. Maple 5 and 6 take the left side. Everyone else with me. They climbed higher, rolled inverted, and dove again. This time the Germans were ready, but ready didn't mean capable. The Me-109s tried to turn into the attack, but at the speed the Canadians were moving, turning was impossible. More German fighters fell, some shot down, others damaged badly enough that they had to break off and limp home. On the third pass the Germans broke completely. What had started as 40 fighters heading for the invasion fleet was now a scattered mess of individual aircraft fleeing south, back toward France, leaving behind 16 burning wrecks and 3 pilots dangling from parachutes. Edwards checked his ammunition. Nearly empty. Fuel was getting critical. But the German formation was no longer a threat, and below them the invasion fleet steamed on, untouched. Maple Squadron, this is command. Confirm kill count. Edwards looked around at his pilots, all of them still flying, all of them still alive. Command Maple Leader. 16 confirmed destroyed, multiple damaged and driven off. Enemy formation neutralized. There was a long pause. Maple Leader, say again. 16? Confirmed. 16 Me-109s down. No friendly losses. Another pause, even longer. When the controller spoke again there was awe in his voice. Maple Leader, that's extraordinary. Well done. Return to base for rearm and refuel. And Maple Leader? Supreme Commander wants to speak with you personally upon landing. Edwards felt a chill. Eisenhower wanted to speak with him. That could be good or very, very bad. But as he turned his Spitfire west toward England, and looked down at the invasion beaches where men were now landing, he realized he didn't care. They'd done their job. Those boys down there would have a chance because 12 Canadian pilots had refused to play it safe. They landed at 0630, just as the sun cleared the horizon. Ground crews swarmed the aircraft, refueling and rearming them with frantic speed. Edwards climbed out of his cockpit, his flight suit soaked with sweat, his hands shaking from adrenaline. Boss. McNair was running toward him, his face split by a grin. Did you hear? We got 16. 16 in one pass. Edwards nodded, too tired to smile. Anyone hit? Maple 7 took some flack, but he's fine. Stocky, we just pulled off the impossible. We did what needed doing. A staff car pulled up, tires screeching. A British officer jumped out, a full colonel, looking harried and excited. Squadron Leader Edwards? You're to come with me immediately. Supreme Commander's orders. The drive to Eisenhower's headquarters took 20 minutes. Edwards spent the entire time running through the engagement in his mind, trying to figure out if he'd made any mistakes, broken any rules that would get him court-martialed. They'd been ordered to patrol a specific sector. They'd left that sector to engage the enemy. Technically that was a violation of orders. But they'd saved the fleet. That had to count for something. Eisenhower's command center was controlled chaos. Officers rushing between rooms, telephones ringing constantly, maps covered with markers showing the positions of units across Normandy. Edwards was led through the confusion to a private office where Eisenhower sat behind a desk, studying reports. The Supreme Commander looked up as Edwards entered. His face was unreadable. "Squadron Leader Edwards. I've been reading about your morning." "Yes, sir." 16 confirmed kills. No losses. Against a force more than 3 times your size. Eisenhower set down the report and looked Edwards straight in the eye. "How?" Edwards chose his words carefully. "We use speed and altitude advantage, sir. Vertical diving attacks that didn't give the enemy time to respond. It's a tactic we've been developing for 2 years. The Caveman dives." The words hung in the air between them. Edwards felt his jaw tighten, but he kept his voice level. "Some people call them that, sir." Eisenhower stood and walked to the window, looking out at the airfield where fighters were taking off and landing in a continuous stream. "I'm going to be honest with you, Squadron Leader. I had doubts about the Canadian squadrons. Your tactics seemed reckless. Undisciplined. I thought you were going to get yourselves killed and take other good pilots with you." He turned back to Edwards. "I was wrong." Edwards felt something loosen in his chest. "I'm looking at reports from up and down the invasion front," Eisenhower continued. "The Luftwaffe tried to hit us with everything they had this morning. They threw over 200 fighters at the fleet. Do you know how many got through to attack our ships?" "No, sir." 12 aircraft out of over 200. The rest were shot down or driven off. And according to these reports, your squadron alone was responsible for almost a tenth of the total kills." Eisenhower shook his head. "That's not just impressive, Squadron Leader. That's the difference between success and catastrophe. If those 40 Me-109s had reached the landing craft." He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. They both knew what would have happened. Hundreds of men dead, landing craft sunk, the entire invasion timetable thrown into chaos. "I need you to teach your tactics to every fighter squadron in my command," Eisenhower said. "I need every pilot doing what you do. Can you do that?" Edwards thought about it. Thought about sharing the techniques that the Canadians had developed through trial and error, through losses and victories, through 2 brutal years of combat. Thought about American and British pilots learning to dive like mavericks. "Yes, sir. But with respect, sir, it's not just about the tactics. It's about trust. Trusting your aircraft, trusting your training, and trusting yourself to do things that look impossible." Eisenhower nodded slowly. "Then teach them that too." He extended his hand. "You and your pilots saved a lot of lives today, Squadron Leader. Don't think it's gone unnoticed." Edwards shook his hand, then saluted and left. As he walked back through the command center, he heard officers talking in urgent tones about the battle developing inland, about paratroopers cut off behind enemy lines, about tank columns trying to push through the hedgerows. The invasion was far from over. This was just the beginning. He got back to the airfield to find his squadron already preparing for their next mission. They'd been refueled, rearmed, and were waiting for him. "Where to now, boss?" Bulling asked. Edwards looked at the mission board. Someone had updated the kill tallies. The Canadian squadrons were at the top of the list by a significant margin. "Where do you think?" he said. "Back up. The Luftwaffe isn't done yet, and neither are we." They flew 4 more missions that day. By nightfall, the squadron's total had climbed to 34 confirmed kills. The Germans had learned to avoid them, which meant the Canadians had to hunt harder, ranging farther inland looking for targets. Over the following weeks, as the Battle of Normandy ground on, the Canadian pilots became legends. The Me-109s they'd been sent to fight against learned to scatter at the first sign of Spitfires diving from altitude. German pilots gave them nicknames. Die Fallschirmjäger, the paratroopers, for the way they seemed to fall from the sky without warning. But the cost was high. War is never clean, never simple. McNair was shot down over Cannes on June 18. He survived, but his back was broken. He'd never fly again. 2 days later, a young pilot named Harrison, on his 7th mission, misjudged a dive and couldn't pull out. His Spitfire hit the ground at over 500 miles per hour. Edwards felt every loss like a knife to the gut. But they couldn't stop. The ground troops needed them. The invasion was still hanging by a thread. By the end of June, the numbers were staggering. The Canadian squadrons, using their vertical diving attacks, had accounted for over 300 confirmed German aircraft destroyed. The kill ratio was unprecedented, nearly 10 to 1. For every Canadian pilot lost, they downed 10 German fighters. But the number that mattered most to Edwards was different. According to intelligence estimates, The Canadian squadrons had prevented approximately 75 German air attacks on Allied ground forces. Each of those attacks could have killed dozens or hundreds of soldiers. The math was imprecise, but the conclusion was clear. By keeping the Luftwaffe away from the beaches and the supply lines, the Canadians had saved thousands of lives. In late July, Eisenhower visited the Canadian Air Base in person. By now, word had spread about the Caveman dives, but the tone had changed completely. Instead of mockery, there was respect. American and British squadrons were incorporating the tactics into their own operations. Kill ratios across the entire Allied Air Force were improving. Eisenhower gathered the pilots in a hangar. They stood in their worn flight gear, these men who'd been fighting since 1942, who'd flown through everything the Luftwaffe could throw at them. "Gentlemen," Eisenhower began, "I came here today to apologize." The pilots shifted, uncomfortable. They weren't used to supreme commanders apologizing to them. "Weeks ago I doubted your methods. I questioned your tactics. I thought what you were doing was reckless." He paused. "I was wrong and my mistake could have cost lives. What you've accomplished here is extraordinary. You've changed the way we fight in the air. You've saved countless lives on the ground. And you've proven that sometimes the unconventional approach is exactly what's needed." He looked directly at Edwards. "You were right to trust your training and your instincts. You were right to ignore the people who called your methods primitive. In war, results matter more than doctrine. And your results speak for themselves." Later that evening, Edwards sat outside his quarters, watching the sun set over the channel. Bulling joined him, carrying 2 cups of terrible coffee. "Heard Ike gave us a commendation," Bulling said. "Whole squadron." "Yeah. Never thought I'd see the day when diving like a maniac became official policy." Edwards smiled. "We weren't diving like maniacs. We were using physics. Potato, potato." Bulling sipped his coffee and made a face. "God, this stuff is awful." They sat in silence for a while, listening to the sounds of the airfield. Aircraft engines. Mechanics working. The distant rumble of artillery from across the channel. "You think about McNair?" Bulling asked quietly. "Every day." "Me too. And Harrison. And Cooper. And all the others." Edwards nodded. The weight of command was knowing that every decision you made could mean life or death for the men who trusted you. The weight of survival was knowing that you were still here while better men weren't. "You know what keeps me going?" Edwards said. "Letters from the ground troops. I got one last week from a sergeant in the Royal Winnipeg Rifles. Said they were pinned down by a German tank column, and then they saw Spitfires come screaming down and tear those tanks apart. Said we saved his whole company." He looked at Bulling. "That's what matters. Not the kill counts or the commendations. Knowing that what we do means some kid from Winnipeg gets to go home." Bulling raised his coffee cup. "To the kids from Winnipeg." Edwards clinked his cup against it. "And Toronto. And Vancouver. And Montreal. To all of them." The war in Normandy continued through August. The breakout from the beachhead, the encirclement at Falaise, the drive toward Paris. The Canadian pilots flew mission after mission, their tactics now standard across the Allied air forces. The final tally, compiled after the war, was almost unbelievable. The Canadian squadrons operating over Normandy between June and August 1944 were credited with 1,200 confirmed kills. Not 12,000, as some exaggerated accounts would later claim, but still an extraordinary number representing roughly 15% of all German aircraft destroyed in the theater, despite the Canadians representing less than 5% of Allied fighters. But numbers don't tell the full story. They don't capture the terror of diving at 450 miles per hour, knowing that one mistake means death. They don't show the skill required to hit a target while pulling G-forces that made your vision narrow to a tunnel. They don't explain the trust required to follow a leader into impossible odds. Edwards survived the war. He flew until the very end, racking up 18 confirmed kills and dozens more probables. After the war, he went home to Saskatchewan, married his sweetheart, and became a flight instructor. He rarely talked about his combat experience, but when he did, he always said the same thing: "We weren't heroes. We were just doing our job." But that's not quite true. A hero is someone who does what needs to be done, even when everyone else says it's impossible. A hero is someone who trusts their training and their instincts more than they trust the conventional wisdom. A hero is someone who looks at impossible odds and decides to fight anyway. By that definition, those Canadian pilots were heroes in every sense of the word. The story of the Canadian pilots and their caveman dives is a reminder that sometimes the unconventional approach is the right one. Sometimes the tactics that look reckless are actually carefully calculated risks. Sometimes the people who get dismissed as mavericks are actually innovators who see possibilities that others miss. Eisenhower learned that lesson on D-Day, when 12 Canadian Spitfires held off 40 German fighters and saved the invasion fleet. He never forgot it. Years later, when he was President of the United States, he would tell the story to military commanders as an example of why you should never dismiss someone's methods just because they don't fit the textbook. "Those Canadian pilots," he would say, "taught me that there's a difference between discipline and rigidity. Discipline is following the rules that matter. Rigidity is following the rules that don't. The key is knowing which is which." The war changed aerial combat forever. The tactics developed by the Canadians, refined through brutal trial and error, became standard doctrine. Vertical diving attacks. High-speed hit-and-run strikes. Using speed and surprise to overcome numerical disadvantage. These weren't caveman tactics. They were the future of air warfare. But more than that, the Canadian pilots proved something fundamental about human nature. They proved that respect must be earned, not assumed. They proved that results matter more than pedigree. And they proved that sometimes the greatest warriors are the ones nobody expects. In the years after the war, as the story spread, it grew in the telling. The number of German planes shot down multiplied in retellings until it reached the mythical 12,000. The actual number, around 1,200, was impressive enough without exaggeration. But myths serve a purpose. They remind us of what's possible when courage meets skill, when innovation meets necessity. Today there are memorials to the Canadian pilots scattered across Normandy. Small plaques in village squares. Museum exhibits showing their aircraft. Old photographs of young men in leather jackets, squinting against the sun, trying to smile despite knowing they might not survive the next mission. Edward's Spitfire is in a museum in Ottawa. Children press their faces against the glass, looking at the faded kill marks on the fuselage, trying to imagine what it was like to fly into combat against impossible odds. If they could ask Edwards what it was like, he would probably say something modest and self-effacing. But his actions spoke louder than any words. He and his fellow pilots rewrote the rules of aerial combat, saved thousands of lives, and proved that sometimes the most important thing you can do is trust yourself when everyone else doubts you. The lesson of the Canadian pilots isn't just about military tactics. It's about life. It's about standing firm in the face of criticism when you know you're right. It's about having the courage to do things differently, even when the conventional wisdom says you're wrong. It's about proving yourself through results, not arguments. When Eisenhower called their tactics caveman dives, he was using the language of dismissal, the way people always do when they encounter something they don't understand. But those Canadian pilots didn't argue. They didn't defend themselves. They simply went out and showed the world what they could do. And when the smoke cleared and the invasion succeeded and the war was won, nobody called them cavemen anymore. They called them heroes. The story has one final chapter, one that occurred decades after the war ended. In 1994, on the 50th anniversary of D-Day, veterans from all over the world gathered in Normandy to commemorate the invasion. Edwards was there, now in his 70s, walking slowly through the same fields where he'd once flown at 400 miles per hour. A young reporter approached him asking for an interview. She wanted to know about the famous caveman dives, about the moment when he decided to attack 40 German fighters with just 12 Spitfires. Edwards was quiet for a long time, looking out at the beaches where so many men had died. "You want to know what I was thinking?" he finally said. "I was thinking about a kid I knew from Regina. He was 19 years old, enlisted in the infantry. He wrote me a letter before the invasion, said he was scared but ready to do his duty. I was thinking about him and thousands like him, getting ready to run onto those beaches into machine gun fire. And I thought, if they can do that, then I can damn well do my job and keep the Germans off their backs. So you attacked. So we attacked. Were you scared?" Edwards smiled. "Terrified. Anyone who tells you they weren't scared is either lying or crazy. Fear is what keeps you sharp. It's what makes you check your six, watch your fuel, not do anything stupid. But you did something that looked stupid. You attacked when you were outnumbered 3-1. It wasn't stupid. It was necessary. There's a difference." He paused. "The stupid thing would have been to play it safe and watch those boys on the beach die because we weren't willing to take a risk." The reporter scribbled notes, then looked up. "Do you think General Eisenhower was wrong to doubt you?" Edwards considered the question. "No," he said finally. "He was doing his job. He had to worry about the whole invasion, coordinate thousands of moving parts. He didn't have time to understand every tactic every unit was using. What matters is that when we showed him what we could do, he listened. He admitted he was wrong. That takes more courage than any dive I ever made. You respected him. I did. He was a great leader. And great leaders know when to trust the people under their command, even when they don't understand everything those people are doing. The interview ended, but Edwards stayed on the beach watching the waves roll in. Somewhere out there, beneath the water, were the wrecks of landing craft and tanks, the physical remains of the largest invasion in history. But the real legacy wasn't in the metal and rust. It was in the millions of people who lived free because of what happened here. He thought about his squadron, the men he'd flown with. Some had survived the war and gone home to normal lives. Others were buried in military cemeteries scattered across Europe, forever young. All of them had done their part. As he turned to leave, a young boy ran up to him, maybe 8 years old, speaking rapid French. His mother hurried over, apologizing, but Edwards just smiled. "He wants to know if you're a pilot," the mother translated. Edwards knelt down to the boy's level. "I was, a long time ago." "Were you here? On D-Day?" I was up there." He pointed at the sky. The boy's eyes went wide. "Did you fight the Germans?" "I did." "Were you scared?" Edwards thought about lying, giving the boy some heroic answer. But he decided on the truth. "Yes, I was very scared." "But you did it anyway?" "I did it anyway. Because sometimes being brave doesn't mean not being scared. It means being scared and doing what needs to be done anyway." The boy nodded, seriously processing this. Then he saluted, a child's awkward approximation of a military salute. Edwards returned it, a lump in his throat. As the boy and his mother walked away, Edwards realized that this was why it all mattered. This boy would grow up free, would never know the terror of occupation, would have chances and opportunities that only existed because of what happened here 50 years ago. That was the real measure of success. Not the kill counts or the medals or the commendations. The measure was in the lives that continued, the children who grew up in peace, the future that was saved. The Canadian pilots who flew over Normandy didn't think of themselves as heroes. They thought of themselves as men doing a job that needed doing. But heroism isn't about how you think of yourself. It's about what you do when the moment demands everything you have. On June 6, 1944, 12 Canadian pilots faced 40 German fighters and decided to attack. It was a decision that should have been suicide. Instead, it became legend. They dove from the sky like falling angels, their engines screaming, their guns blazing, moving at speeds that made the impossible possible. They hit the German formation like a thunderbolt, destroyed 16 aircraft in minutes, and saved the invasion fleet from catastrophe. And when people called it a caveman dive, they proved that sometimes the best response to mockery is simply to do your job so well that the mockery turns to awe. This is the legacy of those Canadian pilots. Not just their tactics or their kill ratios, but their attitude. The refusal to be defined by others' expectations. The courage to trust their own judgment. The determination to protect the people who depended on them, no matter the cost. In the end, that's what heroism looks like. Not dramatic speeches or grand gestures, but quiet determination. Not seeking glory but accepting duty. Not avoiding fear but acting despite it. Eisenhower called them cavemen. History calls them heroes. They would probably prefer to be called what they were. Pilots who did their job, who trusted their training, who looked after their wingmen, and who came home knowing they'd made a difference. Edwards passed away in 2016 at the age of 96, one of the last surviving aces of World War II. His funeral was attended by pilots from around the world, men and women who'd studied his tactics, who'd learned from his example. The caveman dive is now taught at every fighter pilot school in the Western world. It has a different name now, something technical and official. But the principle remains the same: speed, surprise, and the courage to do what others think is impossible. Those 12 Spitfires that dove from the sky on D-Day didn't just change the course of a battle. They changed the course of history. They proved that innovation matters. That skill matters. That courage matters most of all. And they proved something else, something that resonates far beyond the battlefield. Never let someone else's doubt define your limits. When Eisenhower called it a caveman dive, those Canadian pilots didn't argue or complain. They just went out and showed the world what they were capable of. That's the real lesson. That's the real legacy. Not the victories or the medals, but the simple truth that sometimes the only way to prove yourself is to do the impossible and make it look easy. The sky above Normandy is quiet now. But if you listen carefully, on certain summer mornings when the light is just right, some say you can still hear it, the distant scream of Merlin engines diving from the sun.